So I lived in Egypt for a while, Jay, and when I was there, for years before and years after, the U.S. was always trying to prevent Egypt from disintegrating into a choice between the army on the one hand and the Islamic extremists on the other. But this week it feels like that's exactly where we are, and the U.S. seems powerless to do very much about it.
Yeah, I think they're very much stuck right now, where you have the military back in power and they're trying to sort of dismantle the Islamists, and you have the kind of a transition period setting up. But I think we're going to be in another position in 5 or 6 months where some of the stuff you talked about in the past, where the Islamists who do have a big base are basically suppressed, and then you have the military, and there's really no stable middle. And so we could keep bouncing back and forth.
And if Islamists are suppressed, if the Muslim Brotherhood is suppressed, does it become more extremist as a reaction? That's what you tend to see in the Middle East, right?
Yeah, I think that's the fear, that these guys don't have militias built up like in Lebanon with Hezbollah and stuff, but they do have a history of there are extremist groups inside Egypt, some kind of linked, or at least ideologically linked at some point, to the Muslim Brotherhood, who, you saw a lot of bad terrorist attacks in the 80s and the 90s to elements that eventually became Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. And what leverage does the U.S. have here? We give a lot of military aid to Egypt. They need money from the IMF. Is the U.S. prepared to use any of that leverage?
I think the problem right now, and you could see it, is we don't have that much money when you look at the broader scheme of things. In the last 2 days, 3 Gulf states have given them $12 billion, or pledged $12 billion, which dwarfs the $1.3 billion in military aid we have, and the IMF program would be about $5 billion. So those do play into the calculations, but I think with Morsi before and with these guys now, these IMF programs, as you know, can be pretty destabilizing, with fuel subsidies being cut. And if the Gulf states are pumping in this money, in part because they don't want to see the Muslim Brotherhood, they don't want to see much political reform going on in these countries because they threaten their own systems, our leverage is kind of limited when others have a lot more money to give these guys.
And they're buying a system, or trying to buy a system, in which they know the Muslim Brotherhood will be kept down and repressed, and that the army, if that means the army's in charge, I don't think that's going to bother any of the Gulf states.
Saudi Arabia,
Qatar.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting dynamic since the Arab Spring broke out, where you had these kind of camps forming, where you had Turkey, which is, an Islamist-leaning government that was elected, Qatar, which I don't know exactly where you put it because it is a monarchy, but they've really been supporting Muslim Brotherhood movements, whether Hamas in Palestine, the government in Egypt, the government in Tunisia, and it's really made Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, kind of traditional monarchies very nervous because they think this political Islam could come back and topple them. So Egypt really has, in the last few years, been a bit of a proxy battle. You saw Qatar and Turkey give about $10 billion between the two of them, and these other states didn't give anything until the Muslim Brotherhood was overthrown.
So you almost
came right in.
You almost have to see Egypt and Syria as part of a big regional proxy fight between secular governments, monarchies, and military governments on the one hand, and Islamic governments on the other. That's really what this is all about, essentially, right?
Yeah, some people call it sort of the Arab Cold War, which is playing out. There's been so much focus on the conflict between Sunni and Shia, between Iran and its satellites and Saudi Arabia, but there's also this kind of Arab or inter-Islamic battle going on, a lot of which are Sunni groups, but yeah, they have very different views.